Let's look at the story itself as recorded in history about the Shia Dynasty. In the story of Da Yu, there are many Chinese characteristics that are very different from the ancient legends of Westerners. First of all, Da Yu should never be measured by the standards of mortals, otherwise there will be problems. His own wife and children are not taken care of, and if he is held to the standard of common people, he will become a deadbeat. The so-called saint puts public interest before private interest and forgets private interests, transcending the normal human needs and standards of the common people, or in today's parlance, is called a Superman. Secondly, leadership does not come from the lineage succession. Shun was succeeded, not by his own son, but by a sage of high moral character and talent, Yu. Thirdly, the authority of a leader is unquestionable. According to the ancient books, there was a great flood in Yao and Shun's time. Yao sent Yu's father Gun to treat the water, but he failed. Gun is executed. Shun continued to appoint Yu to handle the water. Yu not only treated the flood, but also opened up the land and the water transportation network of the Yellow River and the Yangtze River, and set up the administrative district of the 9 states. Shun gave the death penalty to Gun, who failed to handle the flood. Gun's son, Yu, did not think of avenging his father's death, but obeyed Shun's order and did his best. The last one is also very unique. In the story of Yu handled the flood, there was no gods or boulders or any of those who came to help, to cast spells and magic powers, and the problem was solved by human beings' own abilities and efforts. The state of a leader comes from personal character, not from lineage, and the leader is capable and selfless, so that without the help of gods or goddesses, everyone submits to the leadership of the saintly leader and pursues a good life together. This expectation has been hidden in the long history of China. Sadly, son of Yu, Qi, who was obviously not a saint, ended the era of the public world and passed the position of leader to his own son, thus entering the era of the family world in the Chinese history. Thus, in terms of scripture, the change in the law of succession of the monarch, aka Son of Heaven in China, by the time of Yu became problematic. It is while Yao and Shun were ceding the throne to the virtuous, Yu passed the empire on his son. This suggests that by the Shia Dynasty, the emphasis on virtue had waned. However, Menshus objected to the claim that virtue and waned, and said heaven may give to the virtuous, or pass it on the sons, and this is not a waning of virtue. In this regard, Cui Shu's 考信录 offered the most common sense insights. He asserts that there was no fixed emperor in ancient times and that the federal lords each elected a virtuous man and obeyed him. There was neither a fixed formula for passing the position of the son of heaven to the virtuous man nor to his son. When the late king died, if there was a sage in his place, he obeyed that sage, and if his son was a sage, he obeyed his son. This explanation is broadly consistent with the facts. In the uncivilized era, the law of succession was unclear and approximated a republican system. It was not determined at the time of Qi in the Shia Dynasty that the empire would be passed on to his son, and the 考信录 states that the passing on to his son was a later decision. The 3 generations of Tai Kang, Zhong Kang, and Xiang, whose virtues declined sharply, failed to maintain their positions and only regained their power by the time of Shao Kang and his son, Zhu, and it was only later that provision was made for succession of Yu's descendants to the emperor throne. This argument originates from Menshus. According to Menshus, at the time of Shang, there were 6 or 7 sage kings, each of whom restored his power and did not lose it until the end. In short, the system of descendant succession had been practiced since the period. It can be said that this view is more tenable than the others. The earliest surviving documents about Yu are those at the beginning of the Shang Shu, such as the Shun Dian and the Yu Gong, but they're also the most skeptical. In recent years, a bronze Sui Gong disc was discovered, which was dispersed overseas, and its inscription reads, "Heaven ordered Yu to prepare the earth and dredge the river with the mountains." However, it belongs to the Western Zhou Dynasty, a far cry from the time of Da Yu. There is a very special record in the records of the ground historian, which says that during the period of his rule over the water, Da Yu once asked his assistant Yi to distribute rice seeds to the people to be planted in low-lying and watery places, to open up the 9 states passing through the 9 lands, bevel the 9 swamps, and measure the 9 hills, make Yi to give the people rice and be planted in the hollow white place. 4,000 years ago, there were a large number of white lands on the Henan plain, so the Xinbi people may have been a tribe that lived in wide lands and quickly adapted to the rice agriculture that came from the south. In addition, the Erlitou people had the custom of worshipping dragons, which should also be related to their former waterfront life, because the dragons in the ancient legends were aquatic, and their forms were close to those of snakes. Gu Jiegang had long ago discovered that the character of Yu is derived from the word for wall, which means a curled-up snake, and in ancient history recording, the name of Yu's father, Gun, which is said to be some kind of water creature, which is said to be turned into a yellow dragon after his death. The royal family name of Shia Dynasty was Si, and in later oracle bone inscriptions and gold inscriptions, its Yi part was written in the shape of a curled snake. In other words, snake worship has been going on since ancient times.
Let's re-examine the story of Da Yu's flood retreatment. During Yao's time, flooding occurred. Yao ordered his ministers Gun to treat the flood. His method of treatment is blocking, which is not good enough, and he was chopped off. Yao asked Yu, the son of Gun, to continue to treat the flood. Yu learns his father's lesson and focuses on dredging. After 8 years, Yu finally succeeds in treating the water. Why did Da Yu want to cure the flood? It wasn't because of his father didn't cure the water. He couldn't help it. Do you think he wanted to? The king's orders are hard to disobey. Yao's law is green. Gun didn't cure the flood and put it into any destiny as long as it's not a chin, will not be chopped. At most, it's not good to do the job, and he removed from office. Yu was also very secret. He was so afraid that he couldn't go home 3 times to see his wife, and when he was able to go home, he found out his wife had given birth to son. Later, when Da Yu became the king, he thought that what had happened to him could not happen again, and that he could not let his own fate happen to his children, so he passed the throne to his son, Qi. The pure spirit of Confucianism is benevolence, and those who are benevolent are invincible. The governance of the country emphasizes internal sainthood and external kingship, which simply means convincing people by virtue. Can a king who believes in Confucianism do something unfavorable and then click someone off and let his son continue to work? This is not benevolent. That's why it's not Confucianism's fault that Da Yu rolled over the water. Yao's laws were as impersonal, harsh, and detailed as Qin's. The ancient legalist Han Fei's assertion about the king, the lord of 10,000 vehicles and the ruler of 1,000, who therefore controls the world and conquers the vessels, does so by his might. If the might lies in the lord alone, the masses will be afraid. If the might is divided among the ministers, the orders will not be carried out. Therefore, when a sage ruler rules the world, his power lies in the lord alone and is not shared with his ministers. The idea of governing the country, the punishment does not avoid the noble. Reward good deeds, do not leave the ordinary people. So do you see what I mean? Gun is killed because he is not avoiding the noble and the ministers. Yu is the king because he is rewarding the good deeds. Therefore, the conclusion is that the evil deed of Da Yu ruling the water is the work of the legalists and has little to do with Confucianism. These myths and legends of Da Yu reflected the values of the people who wrote the myths. The earliest version of the King Arthur legend did not have cohabited with the financially supported mysteries. Later, when courtly romance became fashionable, the legend of King Arthur also had affairs. The originator of legalism was Guanzhong, who started the nationalization of brothels and the industrialization of salt and iron. It's possible that the legend of Da Yu was a commentary made up in the era, maybe even later. It's very ridiculous that the father is killed and has to submit to the allegiance. That is very Chinese in the ancient legends. The Manchus conquered China, and in front of the Han Chinese, they were the emperors of the people, supreme. But with the Manchus, the barbarian republican tradition has been preserved. Emperors are elected. What? The emperor is supreme? That's only the Han Chinese. In conclusion, China's ancient history before the Qin dynasty is basically a Pinghua, myths, legends, and dramas because of the lack of evidence. Relying on the historical records, the Pinghua can be. There is a lack of evidence for all kinds of hypotheses. China simply does not allow the foreign scholars to dig in China. Historians and archaeologists have been digging in Egypt, the Middle East, India, and Turkey for centuries. Evidence is very important. No evidence? Then write historical records. Write myth. Defending the history of Chinese civilization as beginning with Shang does not mean that people understand Shang. Shang writing is oracle-born writing, not much historical record of the time. Ancient Chinese farming appeared very early. There are fossils. Ancient Chinese water conservancy appeared very late, likely a few waves of westward migration. The Aryans were already white, the Sumerians. It's impossible to determine any race, and there was no way to categorize races back then. Ancient China was clearly influenced by the Western world, and the Western world of ancient China was what Europeans called the Eastern world. The Chinese called Europe Pythes, the extreme West. More western than the West. India and Persia were the west of ancient China. The architecture and aesthetics of ancient China were reedited by Indo-Persian civilization. It is difficult to understand why concrete and load-bearing wall technology was not introduced to China before the Ming Dynasty. China was not so closed and isolated. Ancient China's concept of life and death and religion is also close to Sumerian. Both are this life. Yang Shao culture could be from Sumerian. Shang culture could be from Aryan. The two hypotheses are not contradictory. The Yellow Emperor could have been an Aryan who mastered the high technology of bronze weapons and conquered the aborigines of the Central Plains. It's not uncommon for a few to rule and conquer the majority of aborigines. The Mongols rule over Chinese, India, and Russia aborigines. Ancient China still has the legend of the Great Flood, so that's like the Middle East again. The Shang people also worshipped animals, so that's like the Middle East again. Ancient Chinese history anyway is missed. The history of the Qing dynasty is already missed. What was life like in ancient China? Chinese people simply cannot figure out. On the other hand, what was the life of ancient European like? The Europeans, the Americans knew exactly what it was like. These are the gaps in historical research. Firstly, China's historical records are not rich enough. Secondly, China lacks an archival tradition. Thirdly, Chinese historiography is really just a Chinese fantasy. What kind of things are left behind in Chinese history? Lord Cao Cao led 100,000 troops down to the southern of the Yangtze River, generous poems, and then the literature around him one by one to make speeches about a lot of famous articles in history. This is a nation of good articles. Shi Kefa wrote a song and a stirring article before his death, and Dogon persuaded to surrender and wrote a great article. Those good articles make up the history of China. But you have no idea how many men Dodo had under his command when he besieged Yangzhou, and you are not sure how much money and the grain Shi Kefa had in his hand. This is impossible in Europe. How much grain and rations the 1,000 knights need, how much money they need to pay, how they levy grain and rations. They leave a very clear record along the way. Chinese history and Chinese culture are vague, ambiguous, and untrue. This makes it easy for you to understand the way that what Rui Huang means by numerical management. But the historians of Europe have those very trivial records. The price of hens has gone up this year, and wheat has not. How much the Lord had been short this year, and how much he hoped to raise the taxes, but lost his case or won it. His Majesty King Henry discussing with the Parliament how much he ought to put out in subsidies in this year, and the Parliament thinking that he ought not to put out so much, and both sides at each other's throat again. These records are very specific, and not a word is wrong. Let's say Congress says we can't afford to pay £1,000 and we'll only pay £500, then it must be £500 because it is the congressman himself who is paying the money. But if it is Zhang Juzheng said I collected how much tax this year, or statistics of acres of land, it is completely unreliable. It is likely to report his year's production of 5 million. In fact, the bottom of the collection of more than 50 million, which along the way from the chief of grain to the officials at all levels, from whom the handover will be debated so part. Farmers do not know how much they paid. The government does not know how much they received. For example, the generals reported to the court that I led an army of 10,000 and went out to crush Manchu, but in reality only 5,000 soldiers were brought out. The support of 10,000 soldiers rations, but in the end of the army to the hands of less than 10,000 people. Only the Manchu people knew that Ming Empire sent only 5,000 people, but the history books still record 10,000 people. 100,000 people will of course go down in the history books and then be quoted over and over again, but it's a number that's hard to take seriously, even if it's included in the UN-edited series of general global histories. Most of the figures in Chinese history are bullshit. Chinese history is basically a master of first defining a position and a point of view, then using the historical data as a weapon in its own defense, linking them together, then use it to cajole the layman. A little American kid knows in minutes what our customers of the ancient Romans were, what they were, and what their way of life was like, as long as he is willing to read the reading list assigned by the teacher. A Chinese scholar who can figure out the lifestyle of Qing Dynasty people? The traditions of today's Chinese are really the evolution of the Ming and Qing traditions. And therefore, the Ming Dynasty was the Mongolia. The Mongols brought a lot of things with them. The Chinese learned to sit in chairs. They learned to wear cotton clothes. Their way of life changed. The Chinese began to pursue luxury and ostentation in the Ming Dynasty. Notice that Japanese temples, low-key. That's ancient China. And Chinese temples, high-profile, flying eaves. That's the Ming and Qing traditions. There are too many examples of this. China is a country that doesn't understand its own country. The historical records is a great work of literature and Pinghua storytelling, but by modern historical standards, it cannot be cited as credible history. Period. The problem with the historical records obviously is not only the lack of external evidence, the lack of textual comparisons, the various absurd and bizarre myths of the historical records itself. The internal critic make a lot of fools of himself. Historical accounts, the real, piled on the top of each other. Logical consistency. The ancient history in historical records, Pinghua storytelling. Let's not talk about that. Those storytellings are too old. The history of the Han Dynasty, the period of the author, writing in the historical record is full of contradictions and absurdities. First is errors in later copies have resulted in making a lot of fools of itself. The authority for the study of historical record is in Japan, which is the interpretation of some Japanese scholars. Even if this interpretation is valid, it shows that historical record is not a credible history and cannot be used as the source for quotations. And second, more likely, the author Sima Qian was writing his own legend and fantasy storytelling, praising and criticizing the world, created this contradiction. Note that Sima Qian, the father of ancient Chinese history, wrote history and was building his own system. This is a completely different way of thinking than the authors of all the Western historical chronicles. Sima Qian is through the historical record to express their own philosophical thinking system. History, based on this heap of evidence, creates countless faults and contradictions. Chinese history, all praise and criticism of the world. 24 history are storytellings, cannot be treated as a credible history. Jonathan Dermot Spence admired Sima Qian. However, if he wrote Chinese history, he could not quote directly from the historical record because this is a completely different thing. Sima Qian was the founder of the old Chinese historical system. Sima Qian's account of the war between the Han Empire and the Hans is simply metaphorical storytelling, not a fantasy novel. Anyway, today there is a great victory, tomorrow also great victory. Always in great victory and great victory. Kill countless enemies, kill the enemies to the end. Prisoners are on the battlefield. Are the Huans clones? If they are killed today, they clone their enemy tomorrow. The history of China, initiated by Sima Qian, is the history of the great people. It was not a narrative history, which is a clear difference from the Western historical tradition. Chinese history today is clearly not the Sima Qian system, but Western narrative history. In ancient China, history was taken very seriously and history was political propaganda. 24 history is 24 Chinese version of the Bible. The founding emperor is always baby of the sun, the gods, anyway, is the world's living savior. The ends of the previous dynasty always all kinds of evil, all kinds of people are in sorrow. So in the unique terminology of the Chinese civilization itself, the Zhu Xia laid down its own scriptures and histories. Jing means that the basic law and the orthodoxy are the yardsticks by which values are measured. History means value judgment and historical construction based on Jing, legitimacy, and the historian exercised the function of a world court through history compilation. In the Chinese tradition, which has a weak religious background, the historian partly assumed the mission of the Orthodox Church and the constitutional court in the West. Historiography has the special task of delivering justice and upholding the morals and beliefs of the nation. The importance of historical independence for the Chinese-speaking world is the same as the importance of juridical independence for the West. Therefore, the construction of Chinese history is not a technical problem. At the same time, there is no possibility for historiography to exist independently of scripture. The cognitive picture is holistic, and each part of the revision will affect the whole situation. The scriptures Jing are the pillars of the cognitive picture and the ladder for climbing the mysterious world. If there are no beams, there is no place to put the bricks and the mortar. If the beams are wrongly designed, quality bricks and mortar will not be enough to save the building from collapse. Without the ladder, you will be forever imprisoned in the cramped cell of personal experience. If the ladder is bad, the ceiling you can reach is low. Having defined their scriptures, the civilizations have also roughly defined the limits of their development. Where the ladder of scripture cannot reach, the possibilities inherent in cognition are exhausted. Ladders are not equal. Some ladders can take you to higher levels, just as Einstein's ladder could reach levels that Newton's ladder could not, without preventing you from using this ladder to go on to Newton's level. Only a very few advanced civilizations are able to produce their own scriptures. Most humans can only introduce the creations of others. Civilization itself is the process by which scripture unfolds its inherent possibilities. It is only in the earliest stages of unfoldment, adolescence, that the illusion of eternity takes hold. As the harsh winter approaches, she will increasingly feel her limits. At this point, civilization will be faced with the choice between demise and reinvention. The isomorphism and the correlation between cognitive landscape and civilization evolution is extremely strong. Every decline of the Chinese world is directly reflected in the distortion of the cognitive picture. The flood of value nihilism has never been as severe as in 20th century. The triumph of opportunism in the realm of value mirrors the destruction of a community by ruthless wanderers and moral prodigals. Both are products of the reverse elimination mercantilism that transformed the ceremonial state of the spring and autumn period into the cannibalistic paradise of modern history. The wondrous mystery of discourse had led to a complete reversal of the code of value, which is a major reason for the downfall of civilization. The great figures praised by the nihilistic view of history are often the squanderers of civilization, the destroyers or drawers of community. The accumulators and protectors are instead silenced or even deliberately verified. The sins are more significant than the events themselves, for vultures do not hover over the heads of the living. Rats dare to jump on the dinner table because the ship they are on is in jeopardy. There are two problems with Chinese history. The first is the people lack the respect for the name of the righteousness, and the emperor was actually a rotating class, which was different from Japan and Europe. Sima Qian's storytelling has expressed this education. The king and his vassals would rather have their own can. China entered the era of humanistic thinking at a very early stage. The second is, the ancient China's administrative system was so low-grade that it took until the Yuan Dynasty to learn the province system of Central Asia. Later, the Ming and Qing dynasties inherited it. Look at Byzantium, a 1,000-year empire, and it was the Turks, the outsiders, who finally destroyed Byzantium. Byzantium was beaten by Persia, by the Arabs, by the Western Crusaders, by all sorts of violent beatings. But anyway, it just couldn't be defeated until finally the Turks appeared.